The world stands on the threshold of a stunning demographic transformation brought about by falling fertility and rising longevity. It's called global aging, and it promises to reshape virtually every dimension of economic and social life. For most of history, until well into the 19th century, the elderly, here defined as adults aged 60 and over, only comprised a tiny fraction of the population, never more than 4 or 5% in any country at any time. In the developed countries today, they comprise 22% of the population. 3 decades from now, in 2040, that share is on track to reach 31%, and that's just the average. In Japan and the fast-aging countries of continental Europe, it will be approaching or passing 40%. The developing world as a whole is still much younger, but it too is aging, with some countries traversing the entire demographic distance from young and growing to old and stagnant or declining at a breathtaking pace. By 2040, Brazil and Mexico will be nearly as old as the United States, and China will be older. Meanwhile, Korea will be vying with Germany, Italy, and Japan for the title of oldest country on Earth. We live in an era of many challenges, from global warming to global terrorism. But few are as certain as global aging, and few are as likely to have such a large and enduring an impact on the size and shape of government budgets, on the future growth in living standards, and on the stability of the global economy. Global aging promises to affect everything from business psychology and worker productivity to the structure of the family and the direction of global capital flows. Perhaps most fatefully, it could throw into question the ability of societies to provide a decent standard of living for the old without imposing a crushing burden on the young. 10 or 15 years ago, global aging barely registered as a policy issue. Today, it has become the focus of growing concern. Many governments are beginning to debate, and some have enacted major reforms. Most of the concern, especially in the developed world, is focused on the rising fiscal cost of government benefit programs. Most developed countries have expensive pay-as-you-go public pension systems that were put in place back in the early post-war decades when workers were abundant and retirees were scarce, but which have now been rendered unsustainable by the collapse in birth rates and the steady rise in longevity. Graying also means paying more for health care because the elderly typically consume at least 3 times more per capita in medical services and at least 10 times more in long-term care services than the non-elderly. Meanwhile, in the developing world, countries are beginning to worry that they may grow old before they grow rich. Although the rising fiscal burden of pay-as-you-go benefit systems is a major issue in a few countries, the most pressing concern is often the growing vulnerability of the old. Many developing countries are aging before they have had time to put in place the social protections of a modern welfare state. In China, India, and Mexico, only a fraction of the workforce is earning a benefit under a pension system, public or private, and the majority of elders still depend heavily on the extended family for support in old age. Yet the informal support networks on which elders depend are already under assault by the forces of modernization and will soon come under intense new pressure as populations age and family size declines. Yet despite the concern about global aging, there exists no satisfactory measure of how well countries worldwide are actually responding to the challenge. The purpose of the Global Aging Preparedness Index, or GAP Index, is to meet this need. The GAP Index projections extend from 2007, the base year used in making long-term indicator comparisons, through 2040. The index covers 20 countries, including both developed economies and a selection of economically important emerging markets. The overall gap index consists of two separate sub-indices, the Fiscal Sustainability Index and the Income Adequacy Index. The sub-indices in turn are based on indicators grouped into distinct categories, each dealing with a different dimension of the challenge. On the fiscal side, the gap index begins by looking at projections of the total public burden of old age benefit spending, including both pensions and health benefits. But the index also goes further. It takes into account the differing fiscal room that countries have to accommodate the growth in old age benefits. It also considers the degree of elderly dependence on public benefits, which may be a crucial factor in determining how politically easy or difficult it will be to enact new cost-cutting reforms, or indeed to follow through on reforms that have already been enacted but not yet phased in. While I don't have time to discuss all of the indicators in detail, it's worth highlighting some of the most significant results. Let's begin by looking at the public burden category and the benefit level and growth indicators. As you can see, today's emerging markets generally have low public burdens compared with the fully developed economies, both because they have relatively young populations and because coverage under their public benefit systems is often far from universal. Old age benefits in most emerging markets are projected to grow rapidly as their populations age, nearly doubling in India, nearly tripling in China, and quadrupling in Korea. Even so, only Brazil, where they are projected to reach 20% of GDP, will rank among the 10 highest burden countries in 2040. The developed countries generally have much higher burdens, although there is a wide range of outcomes. The differences are due in part to demographics and in part to the varying generosity of benefit systems, especially pensions. The lower burden English-speaking countries both spend less per capita on old age benefits and are due to age less. The higher burden countries of continental Europe generally have the most expensive public old age benefit systems and the fastest aging populations. Japan is a special case. It faces a massive age wave, but its pension benefits are already less than generous and are scheduled to be reduced even further in the future. A few countries, notably Korea and the United States, score much better on level than on growth. In the case of Korea, the explanation lies mainly in its unusually severe demographics. The United States, in contrast, faces a relatively benign demographic future. The generosity of its public pension system is also modest by developed world standards. What gives the United States its 15th place ranking on benefit growth is its exceptionally rapid rate of growth in health benefit spending. There are also a number of countries that score significantly better on growth than on level, notably Sweden, Germany, Japan, Italy, and France. All have enacted reforms in recent years that are scheduled to cut average public pension benefits relative to average wages over the next few decades. These countries spend a lot on old age benefits today and will spend even more tomorrow. But total spending will grow much less than the aging of their populations would otherwise require. The benefit level and benefit growth indicators both add an important perspective to the index. The absolute spending level as a share of GDP is clearly the simplest measure of the total resource burden of aging populations. Yet the rise in spending is also important, since some societies may be institutionally and culturally better equipped to handle high levels of public benefit spending than others. From this perspective, the road ahead for Korea and the United States may be just as bumpy as for some countries that are projected to spend much more. While a large and growing burden is certainly a cause for concern, the magnitude of the burden alone does not tell us whether it is sustainable. It is also crucial to look at the fiscal room that countries have available to accommodate the burden. There are three ways in which countries can adjust to higher old age benefit spending: pay for the growth by raising taxes, pay for the growth by cutting other government spending programs, or pay for the growth by borrowing. The tax option is clearly unsustainable in most developed countries, particularly in Europe. At some point, rather than generate new revenue, higher taxes may simply slow economic growth, exacerbate unemployment, and push more workers into a growing gray economy. The tax option may also prove unsustainable in some emerging markets. Most start with relatively small public sectors, and so would seem to have an advantage. This advantage may be more apparent than real, however, since many also have large informal sectors, which by definition cannot be taxed. While the developed countries may have difficulty pushing total taxation above 50% of GDP, emerging markets like Korea and Brazil may have difficulty pushing it above 40%. To the extent that taxes cannot be raised, countries may be able to accommodate the growing old age benefit burden by reducing other categories of government spending. The budget room indicator points to some useful policy lessons. Countries with large public sectors but relatively small old age dependency burdens tend to have much more budget room than tax room, Sweden being the most striking instance. The implication is that such countries may be able to carve out a lot of extra space in their budgets for old age benefit programs, since presumably they can find a lot of lower priority government spending that can be cut without much cost to society. On the other hand, countries with relatively small public sectors like Japan and the United States may be able to accommodate relatively little growth in old age spending without crowding out vital public services. The final option, at least in theory, is to pay for rising old age benefit costs by borrowing. Except in a few emerging markets, however, this option simply isn't practical. If governments were to simply borrow to cover the projected year-to-year growth in old age benefit spending, 11 of the 20 index countries would have a net debt exceeding 100% of GDP by 2040, and 6 would have a net debt exceeding 150% of GDP. This last high debt group includes not just high benefit growth countries like Brazil and Spain, but also the UK and the United States, which have already used up most of whatever borrowing room they had during the economic crisis. How big is the risk that countries with large and growing old age benefit burdens won't be able to make the necessary adjustments until they hit a fiscal wall, at which point they will have to make the adjustments suddenly and without giving people time to adjust and prepare? Just as important, how big is the risk that countries which have made significant progress in curbing future cost growth will have to roll back the reforms when they begin to cut deeply into benefit programs and elderly living standards? Clearly, one factor that will help or hinder reform is the degree to which the elderly in different countries are dependent on public benefits. As you can see, the level of benefit dependence in most developed countries is quite high. It's worth noting, moreover, that these figures underestimate the absolute level of dependence of most elders, since they are averages for all elders, including the affluent. Even in countries with relatively low benefit dependence, the figures for elders in the middle of the income distribution are much higher. For the United States, the shares are 22% for the average elder versus 38% for the typical elder. For Japan, the shares are 39% versus 61%, and for the UK, they are 42% versus 69%. In France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, more than 70% of the income of a typical elder arrives in the form of a government check, suggesting that some of the countries that most need to cut benefits may have the most difficulty doing so. Although the overall level of benefit dependence is probably the single best indicator of potential political resistance to cost-saving reform, the reliance of the low-income elderly on public benefits may also be an important factor. We therefore include a benefit cut indicator that measures the percentage of elderly households that would be pushed into poverty by an immediate 10% cut in public benefits. The countries that do best on this indicator are generally those in which overall benefit dependence is low. In India, Mexico, or Korea, it would be possible to zero out nearly all public benefits without significantly increasing elderly poverty. The countries that do worst generally have expansive welfare states. In Sweden, Germany, or the Netherlands, with their higher degree of benefit dependence, any given percentage cut in benefits translates into a larger percentage cut in total household income. Aging preparedness is as much about ensuring income adequacy as fiscal sustainability. On the adequacy side, the gap index tracks the level of and trend in the living standard of the elderly relative to the non-elderly in each country, based on income projections that factor in the impact of changes in public benefit programs, private pension provision, and labor force participation rates. It also includes indicators that measure the robustness of old age safety nets and family support networks. What's most striking about the total income of the elderly is how high it is in today's developed countries. The elderly in most developed countries are indeed quite well off compared with the young, much more so than the elderly were a generation ago. But the high total income ratios are also explained by two additional factors. First, the measure of total income used in the gap index includes the cash value of government health benefits, and per capita, the elderly consume much more in health benefits than the non-elderly. Second, the ratios refer to after-tax income, and in most developed countries, the non-elderly bear a disproportionate share of the total tax burden, both because payroll taxes fall much more heavily on the young, and because public, and in some countries private, pension benefits frequently enjoy favorable tax treatment. The relative living standard of the elderly is generally lower in developing countries, and in some cases much lower. The exceptions are Brazil and Chile, which not only have large contributory pension systems, but also robust old age poverty floors. As it turns out, there is considerable overlap in the rankings for the total income level and total income growth indicators. There are, however, some significant differences. France, Japan, and Italy have average rankings on total income level, but very low rankings on total income trend, 17, 18, and 19, respectively. The main reasons for the downward trend: large scheduled cuts in current law public pension benefits, combined with relatively little growth in private pensions or elderly labor force participation. There are also a few countries that rank significantly higher on trend than on level. While Russia, Switzerland, and Spain are in the bottom half of the rankings on level, they all score in the top half on trend. While the total income category tracks how society's overall economic resources are shared between younger and older generations, the income vulnerability category tracks the relative living standard of middle-class elders, a group whose overall income will be much more affected by changes, positive or negative, in the generosity of retirement systems. It also takes into account the degree of elderly poverty in each country. As you can see, the ratios of elderly to non-elderly income are significantly lower for the median than for the total income measure, in part because here we exclude public health benefits. Nonetheless, the relative living standard of the middle-class elderly is still quite high in most countries. In 2040, the ratio of median elderly to non-elderly income is projected to be above 0.9 in 10 countries and above 1.0 in 4. In another 6 countries, the ratio is projected to be between 0.7 and 0.9. Most retirement planners would consider a retirement income equal to 70% of pre-retirement income adequate, and a retirement income equal to 90% or higher excellent. In only 4 countries, Russia, Mexico, Korea, and China, are the median elderly projected to have incomes that seem unusually low relative to the non-elderly. The more important story, however, may be told by the trend indicator. The median income trend indicator is negative in more countries than the total trend indicator, and the projected declines are also larger. Part of the explanation is that the total income measure is buoyed up by rapid growth in health benefits, but part is also that the relative living standard of the median elder suffers much more than the living standard of the average elder when the growth in per capita pension benefits fails to keep pace with the growth in per capita wages. Median elders in developing countries like China, Korea, and Mexico are also more vulnerable to projected declines in family transfers as the number of young shrinks relative to the number of old. The income prospects of middle-class elders may have especially important implications for the future direction of policy changes. The UK has already discovered this. In the early 1980s, it switched the indexation of its basic state pension from wages to prices, effectively flattening the long-term projected growth in pension spending as a share of GDP. But as price indexing caused benefits to decline steadily as a share of wages, calls for a repeal of the reform grew louder. In 2007, amid an emerging consensus that current policy would ultimately impoverish the elderly, the government re-indexed benefits to wages. Along with the living standard of middle-class elders, the degree of elderly poverty is clearly an important dimension of overall income adequacy. The results for the poverty level indicator are instructive, though not especially surprising. The low elderly poverty rates in most continental European countries reflect their overall low levels of income inequality, as well as the generosity of minimum public pension benefits and other cash support for the low-income elderly. The higher poverty rates for the Anglo-Saxon countries and for Japan reflect the higher degree of income inequality and the less generous public old age poverty floors in these countries. With the exception of Brazil, the emerging market countries in the index also have relatively high elderly poverty rates. Brazil's extraordinarily low rate, just 5%, is a testament to the success of its old age poverty floor. In Mexico, which has a similarly skewed income distribution but lacks any floor of old age poverty protection, the elderly poverty rate is 5 times higher. The final category looks at an important dimension of income security not fully captured elsewhere in the index: the extent to which the elderly may be able to rely on the support of their extended families. There are 2 indicators in the category: the share of all elderly who now live in extended families with their adult children, and the change in the average number of surviving children of the elderly from 2007 to 2040. As you can see, the share of the elderly who live with their grown children is generally much higher in the emerging markets than in the developed countries, although Japan, Spain, and Italy have high levels of multi-generational living. Multi-generational living can constitute an important advantage in confronting the aging challenge. It not only allows relatively poor elders to live with their more affluent adult children, it also allows relatively poor young adults to live with their more affluent parents. It mitigates the old age dependency burden not just by providing an extra source of support for the old, but also by providing a form of trickle-down support for the young as well. The young, of course, can provide support to the old in many ways, even if they do not live with them. The family size indicator reveals that the informal support networks elders depend on are likely to come under intense demographic pressure in many developing countries. In China, the average number of surviving children per elder is projected to decline by 1.6 between 2007 and 2040. In Brazil, it is projected to decline by 1.7, in Korea by 1.8, and in Mexico by 2.5. In the developed countries, fertility declined earlier than in the developing world, which means that today's elders already have relatively small families. But a few countries where fertility began to decline late, Italy and Spain, for instance, or which had large post-war baby booms, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and the United States, are also projected to experience significant declines. In Canada, the decline in the average number of children will be 1.5, nearly as large as in China. It's time to take a look at the overall results. The GAP index contains some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that very few countries score well on both sustainability and adequacy. 3 of the 7 highest-ranking countries on the Fiscal Sustainability Index, Mexico, China, and Russia, are among the 7 lowest-ranking countries on the Income Adequacy Index. 4 of the 7 highest-ranking countries on the Income Adequacy Index, the Netherlands, Brazil, Germany, and the UK, are among the 7 lowest-ranking countries on the Fiscal Sustainability Index. There are also 2 countries, France and Italy, that score near the bottom of both indices. Both have legislated large prospective cuts in the generosity of their public pension systems that threaten to erode the living standard of the old. Yet despite the cuts, the systems remain so costly that they will impose a large and rising burden on the young. The good news is that there are exceptions. Australia, which combines a low-cost, means-tested floor of public old age poverty protection with a large, mandatory, and fully funded private pension system, scores in the top half of both indices. So does Chile, which has a similar mix of retirement policies. Several other countries, moreover, are clearly moving in the right direction. Like France and Italy, Germany and Sweden have scheduled deep reductions in the future generosity of their public pension systems. But unlike France and Italy, they are on track to fill in the resulting gap in elderly income by increasing funded pension savings and extending work lives. Although their fiscal burdens remain high, they have been cut well beneath what they would otherwise be without undermining adequacy. Clearly, global aging poses a daunting economic and social challenge. Many fast-aging countries, especially in the developed world, seem to face a difficult choice between relieving the growing fiscal burden on the young and maintaining adequate incomes for the old. Meanwhile, in many developing countries, the choice seems to be just the opposite, whether to impose a new fiscal burden on the young in order to relieve the growing vulnerability of the old. Yet just as clearly, there are many strategies available to address the challenge, and not all involve painful trade-offs. The GAP Index includes a reform guide that assesses the potential payoff of 7 key reform strategies, from reducing public pension benefits and healthcare cost growth to increasing fertility rates and immigration. 2 strategies in particular, extending work lives and increasing funded pension savings, are especially important since they allow countries to escape or at least to mitigate the trade-off between fiscal sustainability and income adequacy. We believe that they offer the best means for the world's aging societies to maintain the living standard of the old without imposing a rising burden on the young.